Sometimes a child's cry for help can change everything. In 1881, 6-year-old Zia watched her mother get beaten nearly to death just for refusing to give up their land. Esmé was a proud black woman who had been born into slavery but fought her way to freedom. She claimed a small piece of ground in Mercy Ridge and worked it with her own hands. The white ranchers wanted her gone. When they left her broken and bleeding in the dirt, little Zia knew there was only one person who might help them. An old Apache chief named Chaska lived alone in the desert hills. Like Esmé, he knew what it felt like to have everything taken away. When Zia found him and cried out those desperate words, something stirred in the old warrior's heart. What happens when two outcasts decide to stand together against a town full of hate? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty expanse of Mercy Ridge, Arizona Territory, where the desert met the mountains in a harsh embrace that had witnessed more bloodshed than most men could count. The year was 1881, and the land still bore the scars of Apache raids, cavalry charges, and the relentless march of settlers who believed manifest. Destiny gave them the right to claim whatever they could, hold with rifle and rope in a small adobe house that sat like a defiant island on 20 acres of scrubland. Esmé Delphine folded her weathered freedom papers with the same reverence another woman might reserve for scripture. The documents, yellowed with age and creased from countless readings, represented more than legal status. They were her proof that she had clawed her way from the cotton fields of Georgia to this patch of Arizona. Dirt that belonged to no one but her. Esmé had been born into slavery on a plantation where the master's kindness extended only as far as keeping his property fed enough to work. She remembered the weight of cotton sacks, the sting of overseers' whips, and the way hope could die a little more each day, until you forgot what it felt like to dream of tomorrow. But she also remembered the night the Union soldiers came, their blue uniforms like pieces of sky fallen to earth, bringing word that President Lincoln had signed papers that made her more than property. Freedom, she learned, was not the same as acceptance. The road from Georgia to Arizona had been paved with closed doors, hostile stares, and nights spent sleeping under stars because no inn would take her money. But Esmé Delphine was cut from cloth that didn't tear easily. When she finally reached the Arizona Territory in 1879, she had $27, a mule named Justice, and a determination that burned brighter than the desert sun. The land office clerk in Tucson had looked at her like she was a mirage when she asked about homestead claims. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the particular weariness of a man who'd explained the obvious too many times. "You do understand what you're asking for?" "I understand I want to buy land," Esmé replied, her voice steady as mountain stone. "I have money, and this is America, where a person can own property if they work for it." The clerk's laugh held no humor. "Yes, ma'am, but Mercy Ridge ain't exactly welcoming to your kind, my kind." Esmé's dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him shift in his chair. "You mean Americans?" "Because that's what I am." She paid her filing fee, signed her papers, and 3 days later stood on 20 acres of hard ground that grew more cactus than crops, where the well ran brackish and the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. It was the most beautiful place she'd ever seen. The first year had been a symphony of small victories and crushing defeats. The adobe house rose brick by brick, built with her own hands, and the occasional help of Mexican workers who asked no questions about the color of her skin as long as her money was good. She planted vegetables in soil that seemed determined to reject anything green, hauled water from a well that demanded negotiation more than digging, and learned that scorpions were less dangerous than the looks she received during her monthly trips to town for supplies. It was on one of those trips that she met Maria Santos, a Mexican woman who ran a small shop behind the Main Street businesses. Maria had looked at Esmé's calloused hands, her sun-weathered face, and the quiet dignity in her bearing, and made a decision that would change both their lives. You work your land alone? Maria asked in accented English. I do. That is hard for a woman. I've done harder things. Maria nodded, understanding passing between them without need for words. You come here when you need supplies. I give you fair price. We women, we help each other, yes? It was Maria who first told her about the Apache chief who lived in the hills. His name is Chaska, she said, lowering her voice as if speaking his name too loudly might summon him. He was a war leader once, fought against the cavalry. Now he lives alone like a ghost in the mountains. Some say he is dangerous. Others say he is broken. I think maybe he's just tired. Esmé filed the information away, another piece of intelligence about this harsh country she was learning to call home. She had no intention of seeking out Apache chiefs, broken or otherwise. She had enough challenges without borrowing. Trouble from men who had every reason to hate anyone with white government papers. The second year brought Zia. The child appeared one morning like a answered prayer. Esmé hadn't dared speak aloud. She was perhaps 4 years old, with dark hair and eyes that held too much knowledge for such a young face. She spoke Spanish and broken English, and when Esmé asked where she came from, the little girl pointed toward the mountains and said simply, "My mama went to the sky." Esmé never learned Zia's full story. The child remembered fragments, a woman's voice singing Spanish lullabies, the taste of beans and cornmeal, the sound of gunshots that came in the night and changed everything. Whether her mother had been Mexican, Apache, or some mixture of both, it didn't matter to Esmé. What mattered was that here was a child who needed what Esmé could give. And Esmé needed someone to pour her fierce love into like water on thirsty ground. Zia transformed the adobe house from a fortress of solitude into a home. Her laughter echoed off the walls as she chased chickens in the yard, or helped Esmé tend the struggling vegetable garden. She learned to read from Esmé's few precious books, learned to cipher numbers by counting eggs and measuring flour, and learned to understand that love was not about blood, but about choice. Why do the people in town look at us funny? Zia asked one afternoon as they returned from their monthly supply run. Esmé considered her words carefully. At 6, Zia was old enough to notice the hostile stares, the way conversation stopped when they entered Maria's shop, the manner in which other children were quickly pulled away when they showed curiosity about the little girl with the bright smile. Some people, Esmé said finally, think the color of your skin or where you come from determines your worth. They're wrong, but they believe it strongly enough to act on it. Are we worth less? Child, you listen to me. Esmé stopped the wagon and turned to face Zia directly. Your worth comes from here. She tapped Zia's chest over her heart. And here, she touched the child's forehead. Not from what other people think they see when they look at you. We work honest, we treat people fairly, we stand up for what's right. That makes us worth more than all the gold in these mountains. By 1881, their little homestead had found its rhythm. Esmé's garden produced enough vegetables to feed them with surplus to trade. Her chickens laid eggs regularly, and she'd managed to dig a second well that ran cleaner than the first. Zia had grown into a quick-witted, determined child who could gentle a spooked horse or negotiate with Mexican traders in rapid-fire Spanish. But success, Esmé learned, could be as dangerous as failure in a place like Mercy Ridge. Clayton Murdoch owned most of the grazing land around Mercy Ridge, and what he didn't own, he intended to acquire. He was a man built like a bull, with hands that could crush a man's windpipe, and eyes that held all the warmth of winter stones. His family had come west after the war, carrying Confederate attitudes and the bitter resentment of men who'd lost everything except their conviction that some people were born to rule and others to serve. Murdoch's ranch employed 30 men, most of them as hard and unforgiving as the land itself. They rode the range with rifles across their saddles and ropes on their belts, ready to deal with rustlers, claim jumpers, or Apache raiders with equal efficiency. In Murdoch's estimation, a black woman on a homestead represented all three. That woman's got no business being out there, he told Sheriff Dalton one afternoon as they shared whiskey in the Silver Dollar Saloon. It ain't natural, ain't safe, and it sure ain't right. Sheriff Tom Dalton was a tired man carrying a badge that felt heavier each year. He'd come west to escape the memories of Gettysburg and Antietam, only to find that violence followed men like him wherever they went. At 52, he understood that keeping the peace sometimes meant looking the other way, when that peace was built on injustice. "She's got legal papers." "Clayton," Dalton said, though his voice carried no conviction. "Filed proper with the territorial government. Papers." Murdoch's laugh was like gravel in a tin cup. "You think papers matter out here?" "This is still wild country, Tom. Wild country has its own laws." Dalton knew what Murdoch meant, and the knowledge sat in his stomach like bad food. He'd seen what happened to people who found themselves on the wrong side of Clayton Murdoch's version of frontier justice. Mexican families who'd worked land for generations suddenly found their wells poisoned or their livestock scattered. Apache who ventured too close to town disappeared into the desert and were never seen again. "What do you want me to do about it?" Dalton asked, though he already knew the answer. "Nothing," Murdoch replied. "Just don't interfere when nature takes its course." The pressure started small, the way pressure always did. Esmé found her fence posts knocked down after storms, her well contaminated with dead animals, her chickens missing or killed by predators that left no tracks. At first, she attributed it to the harsh realities of frontier life. Animals died, fences failed, wells went bad. These things happened, but when she found horse tracks circling her property in patterns too deliberate to be random, when her garden was trampled by hooves in the middle of the night, when rocks began crashing through her windows with messages wrapped around them, Esmé understood that her success had made her a target. "We could leave," she told Zia one evening as they repaired their fence for the third time that month. "Go to California, maybe, or back east where there are more people like us." Zia looked up from the wire she was helping to string. "Do you want to leave?" Esmé studied the land stretching around them, harsh and beautiful in the dying light. She thought of the sweat she'd poured into this soil, the dreams she'd planted here alongside her vegetables, the future she'd envisioned for herself and Zia in this place that had tested every ounce of strength she possessed. "No," she said finally. "I don't want to leave. This is our home." "Then we stay," Zia said with the simple certainty of childhood. "We fight for our home." Esmé smiled, her heart swelling with pride and fear in equal measure. Her little girl was already learning lessons about standing ground, about refusing to be moved by men who believed might made right. She only hoped those lessons wouldn't cost them both more than they could afford to pay. The ultimatum came on a Tuesday morning, when the desert air still held the coolness of night, and the mountains stood sharp against the pale sky. Clayton Murdoch rode up to Esmé's homestead with 5 of his men, their horses kicking up dust clouds that settled like omens on everything they touched. Esmé stepped out of her adobe house with Zia close behind her, her hand resting on the child's shoulder in a gesture that was both protective and steadying. She'd been expecting this visit, had felt it coming in the way animals sense storms before the first clouds appear. "Mrs. Delphine," Murdoch said, touching the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness. His horse, a massive bay gelding, pawed the ground impatiently, as if it too understood the nature of this visit. "Mr. Murdoch." Esmé's voice was steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a bird trying to escape a cage. "I've come to make you an offer." Murdoch shifted in his saddle, leather creaking. "A generous offer for your land here. I'm not selling." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Behind Murdoch, his men sat silent in their saddles, hands resting casually near their gun belts. These were not negotiators, they were enforcers. "Now, you haven't even heard my offer yet," Murdoch said, his tone reasonable, almost fatherly. "I'm prepared to pay you twice what you paid the government for this land. That's more money than most folks see in a lifetime." "I said I'm not selling." Murdoch's facade of politeness began to crack around the edges. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand your situation here. This is rough country, dangerous country. A woman alone with a child. Things could happen." "Bad things." Zia pressed closer to Esmé's side, and Esmé felt the child's trembling through her small hand. But when she looked down, she saw not fear in Zia's dark eyes, but a fierce determination that reminded her of her own reflection. "Are you threatening us, Mr. Murdoch?" "I'm stating facts. Apache still raid through these parts. Rustlers, too. Why, just last month the Henley place got hit. Lost everything, livestock, house, even poor old Jim Henley himself. Terrible thing when a man can't protect what's his." The implication was clear as desert sunlight. Esmé had heard about Jim Henley, a homesteader who'd refused to sell his water rights to Murdoch's outfit. The Apache had been blamed for his death, but everyone in Mercy Ridge knew the Apache hadn't raided in these parts for over a year. "My answer is still no," Esmé said. Murdoch's mask finally slipped completely. His face flushed red above his beard, and his eyes went cold as winter. "You think because you got some papers from the government that makes you belong here? You think this desert gives a damn about your legal documents? I think this is America, and I'm an American citizen with legal right to my property." Citizen. Murdoch spat the word like it tasted bad. "You people got ideas above your station. Time was you knew your place. My place," Esmé said, her voice rising for the first time, "is on my land, in my house, raising my daughter in freedom. That's what your war was supposed to be about, wasn't it? Freedom." One of Murdoch's men, a lean scarecrow of a person with dead eyes, leaned forward in his saddle. "Boss, we gonna jaw all day or—" "Shut up, Pike." Murdoch never took his eyes off Esmé. "Ma'am, I'm going to give you 1 week to reconsider. 1 week to pack up your belongings and accept my generous offer. After that," he shrugged eloquently, "and if I don't, then you'll learn what happens to people who don't understand the natural order of things in this country." The men turned their horses and rode away, leaving behind only dust and the lingering smell of threat. Esmé stood watching until they disappeared beyond the ridge, then knelt down to Zia's level. "Are you afraid?" she asked. Zia considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "A little. But mostly I'm angry." Esmé almost smiled despite the circumstances. "Why angry?" "Because this is our home, and they want to take it just because they think they can. And what do we do when people try to take what's ours?" "We fight," Zia said without hesitation. "We stand our ground." The week that followed was the longest of Esmé's life. She went about her daily routines, tending the garden, feeding the chickens, maintaining the fence. But every shadow seemed to hold watching eyes. Every sound carried the possibility of approaching riders. She cleaned her father's old rifle, the one piece of inheritance she'd managed to keep through all her years of wandering, and taught Zia how to reload the cartridges. "If something happens to me," she told the child one evening, as they practiced by lamplight, "you run to the mountains. Find the Apache chief Maria told us about, Chaska. Tell him what happened here. Nothing's going to happen to you," Zia said fiercely. "Promise me, I promise." But nothing's going to happen. On the 7th day, Esmé woke before dawn and walked to the edge of her property, looking out at the vast expanse of desert and mountain that had become her world. The sunrise painted the landscape in shades of gold and red, and she thought about all the sunrises she'd watched from this spot, all the quiet mornings when the world seemed full of possibility. She was still standing there when they came. This time, Murdoch brought more men, a dozen riders who spread out in a wide semicircle around her house like wolves surrounding prey. But Murdoch himself wasn't with them. The leader was Pike, the scarecrow man with the dead eyes, and Esmé knew immediately that this wasn't going to be another conversation. "Time's up, woman," Pike called out. "Boss gave you a week. Week's done." Esmé had sent Zia to hide in the root cellar beneath the house, but she could feel the child's eyes watching through the small window she'd left uncovered. Whatever happened next, Zia would see it, would carry it with her always. "I told Mr. Murdoch my answer," Esmé said. "This is my land. Not anymore it ain't." They came at her from 3 sides, not bothering with guns because this wasn't meant to be quick. This was meant to be a lesson for anyone else who might get ideas about standing up to Clayton Murdoch. Pike's fists were like hammers, and the other men took turns, making sure the beating was thorough and educational. Esmé fought back as long as she could. But 12 armed men against one woman could only end one way. When she finally went down, her face was bloody, her ribs felt broken, and the taste of copper filled her mouth. But she was still conscious when Pike leaned down close to her ear. "You got until sundown to be gone," he whispered. "You're still here when we come back. We'll finish what we started. And that little girl of yours, well, she might just have an accident too." They rode away, laughing, leaving Esmé lying in the dust beside the fence she'd built with her own hands. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace, and she couldn't find the strength to move. Her vision kept blurring, and every breath sent sharp pains through her chest. It was Zia who found her there an hour later. Zia who tried to drag her toward the house. Zia whose small hands couldn't possibly move, an unconscious woman twice her size. But the child didn't give up. Instead, she did something that would change all their lives. She ran toward the mountains, toward the place where Maria had said the Apache chief lived like a ghost among the rocks. Her bare feet flew across the hardpan, her lungs burned in the thin air, and tears streamed down her face as she climbed higher into the hills where only shadows and memories lived. And when she finally found him, an old man sitting motionless beside a small fire, his weathered face carved with lines that spoke of battles fought and wars lost, she threw herself at his feet and sobbed out the words that would awaken something in his heart. He'd thought was dead forever, there, hurting my black mother. "Please help us." In the silence that followed, Chaska looked down at this small, fierce child who had climbed into his exile with desperate hope in her eyes, and felt the stirring of something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. The old warrior's hand reached for the medicine pouch that hung around his neck, fingers closing around the sacred items that connected him to everything he'd lost, and everything he might still be able to save. Chaska had been sitting by his small fire for 3 days, not moving except to breathe, when the child found him. He'd been preparing for what his people called the final journey, the walk into the spirit world that came when a man had nothing left to fight for in this one. At 67 years old, he'd outlived most of his warriors, his wives, his children, and his purpose. The girl's words hit him like physical blows. "They're hurting my black mother. Please help us!" For a long moment he stared at her without speaking. She was perhaps 6 years old, with dark hair that spoke of mixed blood, Mexican, Apache, maybe something else. Her clothes were torn from running through the brush, her feet were bleeding from the sharp rocks, and her chest heaved with exhaustion. But her eyes burned with the same fierce determination he'd seen in young warriors before their first battle. "Child," he said finally, his voice rusty from disuse, "I am no one's helper anymore." Zia threw herself forward, grasping at his weathered hands. "Please, she's hurt bad. They beat her because she wouldn't leave our land. There's blood and she won't wake up, and I don't know what to do." The words tumbled out in a mixture of English and Spanish, desperation making her switch between languages as she fought to make him understand. Chaska found himself studying her face, seeing in it the ghost of his own daughter Ayana, who would have been about this age when the cavalry came to their winter camp. His war lance stood propped against a boulder behind him, its wooden shaft carved with the symbols of battles won and enemies defeated. He'd carried it through raids against Mexican settlements, cavalry charges, and the long, bitter campaign that had ended with his people scattered to the winds. Now it stood as a monument to a life that felt like someone else's story. "Where is your mother now?" he asked. "By our house." "In the dirt. She's bleeding and I can't make her wake up." Fresh tears started down Zia's cheeks. "She told me if something happened I should find you. She said you'd understand." Chaska closed his eyes. Understanding was a luxury he'd given up years ago, when understanding led only to pain. When the army had come for his band in the winter of 1871, he'd understood that they were outgunned and outnumbered. When they'd forced the survivors onto the reservation at San Carlos, he'd understood that his way of life was ending. When disease and despair had taken his family one by one, he'd understood that the spirits had abandoned them. But this child's desperation touched something Deeper than understanding, it reached the part of him that had once believed protecting the innocent was what separated warriors from mere killers. How? Many men hurt your mother? 12, maybe more. They said she had to leave by sundown or they'd come back and finish it. Chaska opened his eyes and looked at the sun, now past its peak and beginning its descent toward the western mountains. If the child spoke truth, there were perhaps 4 hours before these men returned to complete their violence. And you think an old Apache can help against 12 armed men? My mother says you were a great warrior once. She says you fought the cavalry and won. I fought them, yes. Won? Chaska shook his head. Look around you, child. Do you see victory here? Zia looked around at his camp, a small fire, a few possessions, the bare shelter of rocks and brush that had been his home for 3 years. Then she looked back at him, with eyes that held no judgment, only need. I see a man who's still alive, she said. I see someone who might help my mother when no one else will. The simplicity of her faith cut through his defenses like a blade. Chaska had spent years in this place, telling himself that solitude was wisdom, that staying apart from the world's pain was the only way to find peace. But peace, he realized now, was not the same as surrender. He stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement. The medicine pouch around his neck seemed heavier than usual, filled with herbs and sacred items that connected him to the old ways, the time when healing and warfare were both part of a warrior's duty. What is your name, child? Zia. And your mother? Esmé Delphine. Chaska nodded, committing the names to memory. If he was going to break his 3-year exile, he needed to know who he was fighting for. The men who hurt her, they want her land, they want everything. Our house, our garden, our well. They say black people don't belong here. Chaska's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Black people don't belong. Apache don't belong. Soon they'll decide the desert itself doesn't belong and try to move it somewhere else. He walked to where his war lance stood and lifted it with hands that remembered its weight better than they remembered comfort. The wood was smooth from years of grip, and the iron point still held its edge, despite the years of neglect. Looking at it brought back memories he'd tried to bury. The weight of responsibility, the burden of other people's hope. The terrible mathematics of violence, where protecting one life might require taking another. If I help you, he said slowly, those men will not stop with your mother. They'll come for me too. They'll bring more men, more guns. This could mean war. It's already war, Zia said with startling clarity. They started it when they hurt her for being different. The child was right, and Chaska knew it. Men like those who'd beaten Esmé Delphine didn't stop with one victim. They would keep taking, keep hurting, keep driving out anyone who didn't fit their vision of who belonged in this harsh country. The only choice was whether to fight back or wait for them to come for you in your turn. Your mother, she is a good person. She's the best person in the world. She saved me when I had nobody. She teaches me to read and to be strong and to never let anyone make me feel small. Chaska nodded. He'd known other people like that in his life, people who stood against the storm not because they were unafraid, but because someone had to stand. His own grandmother had been such a person, teaching the children traditional stories, even when the government schools tried to beat the Apache out of them. All right. Zia, I will come. The relief that flooded the child's face was almost painful to witness. She threw her arms around his legs, sobbing with exhaustion and gratitude. But understand this, Chaska said, placing a gentle hand on her head. Once I pick up this lance, once I walk down from these mountains, there's no going back to the way things were. Are you ready for that? Zia looked up at him, her young face serious beyond her years. I'm ready. My mother needs you. Chaska gathered his few possessions, his lance, his rifle, the medicine pouch, and a leather bag containing what remained of his supplies. As he prepared to leave the place that had been his refuge, he felt the weight of old purposes settling back onto his shoulders like a familiar cloak. The old warrior was dead. Something harder had taken his place. The descent from the mountains took an hour, with Zia leading the way along paths that seemed invisible to anyone but a child who'd grown up reading the desert like scripture. Chaska followed, his moccasined feet finding purchase on stone that would have defeated a white man's boots, his warrior's instincts awakening after years of forced sleep. When they reached the homestead, he saw immediately that Esmé Delphine was more than the child had described. She lay unconscious beside her garden fence, her dark skin marked with bruises and cuts. But even in her vulnerable state, he could see the strength in her frame, the calluses on her hands that spoke of honest labor, the way she'd positioned herself even while falling to shield the house where her daughter lived. Mama. Zia rushed to her mother's side, small hands fluttering over the injuries without knowing how to help. Chaska knelt beside the unconscious woman, his experienced eyes cataloguing the damage. Broken ribs, certainly. Possible concussion from the swelling around her left temple. Internal injuries were harder to assess, but her breathing was steady if shallow. She'd been beaten by men who knew how to hurt someone without killing them quickly, a skill that spoke of practice. Is she going to die? Zia's voice was small, terrified. Not if I can help it. Chaska opened his medicine pouch, withdrawing herbs and roots that had been gathered in sacred places, prepared according to traditions passed down through generations of Apache healers. But we need to get her inside, out of this sun. Working together, they managed to half-carry, half-drag Esmé into the adobe house. Chaska was impressed despite himself by what he saw there. The interior was clean and well-organized, with books on a shelf, children's drawings on the walls, and the unmistakable feeling of a place where love lived. This was not the hovel of desperate people clinging to survival. This was a home. He laid Esmé on her bed and began the careful work of traditional healing. The herbs went into a pot of water that Zia fetched from their well, creating a tea that would help with pain and inflammation. He mixed a poultice for the worst of her cuts, his hands moving with the sure movements of someone who treated wounded warriors in the field. Who taught you to do that? Zia asked, watching him work. My grandmother. She said a warrior who couldn't heal was only half a man. Chaska's voice carried the weight of memory. A person who can only destroy will eventually destroy himself. As he worked, Esmé began to stir. Her eyes opened slowly, focusing first on the ceiling, then on Chaska's weathered face bent over her. For a moment, fear flickered in her gaze. She was a black woman in 1881, awakening to find an Apache man in her bedroom. But then she saw Zia beside him, safe and unharmed, and understanding dawned. You came, she whispered. Your daughter is very persuasive. Esmé tried to sit up, winced, and allowed Chaska to gently press her back down. How bad is it? You'll live if you're smart about it. Broken ribs, probably. Concussion, definitely. You need rest and time to heal. I don't have time. Esmé's voice strengthened with urgency. They said they'd be back by sundown. If I'm still here, then they'll find me waiting for them. The simple statement hung in the air between them. Esmé studied Chaska's face, seeing in it the carved lines of a man who'd made difficult decisions and lived with their consequences. Why? She asked. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Chaska was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes looking past her to something she couldn't see. 12 years ago, cavalry soldiers came to my winter camp. They said we were on land that didn't belong to us, that we had to move to the reservation. When my people refused, they burned our lodges and drove us into the snow. My daughter was 6 years old. She froze to death on the 3rd day. Zia moved closer to her mother, instinctively understanding that she was hearing something important, something painful. I'm sorry, Esmé said softly. Her name was Ayana. It means eternal flower. She had eyes like your Zia's, bright and determined, and full of questions about everything she saw. Chaska's voice roughened. I couldn't save her. But maybe I can save this one. Esmé reached out slowly, her fingers finding his weathered hand. You don't have to do this. These men, they're not cavalry soldiers. They're ranchers with the law on their side and the whole town behind them. The law? Chaska's laugh held no humor. The law that says this land belongs to whoever can take it? The law that makes some people worth more than others? I've seen that law in action. From her bed, Esmé could see out the window to the fence posts that marked her property line. The garden she'd coaxed from reluctant soil, the well she'd dug with her own hands. Everything she'd built represented more than mere survival. It was proof that she could create something lasting, something that belonged to her and Zia. "This land means everything to me," she said quietly. "Not because it's pretty or rich or easy to work. Because it's mine. Because I earned it. I understand, do you? I was born a slave, Mr. Chaska. I spent the first 30 years of my life belonging to someone else, like a horse or a plow. When I got free, I swore I'd never belong to anyone again. This land," she gestured weakly toward the window, "this is the first thing I've ever owned that can't be sold or stolen or taken away by someone else's whim. Except it can be," Chaska said gently. "That's why those men beat you. That's why they'll be back." Esmé was quiet for a moment, thinking about Esmé's wedding ring that she still wore on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her clothes. It had belonged to James, the man she'd loved and lost to fever 2 years after they'd made their way west. He'd been a good man, a free man from Louisiana who'd believed in the promise of the frontier. The ring was all she had left of him, all she had left of the dream they'd shared of building something together. James, my husband, he used to say that freedom wasn't something you got, it was something you took. Every day, with every choice you made. She looked at Chaska with eyes that held no illusion about the odds they faced. "I choose to stay. I choose to fight, even if it costs you everything. Everything I care about is already here. My daughter, my home, my right to exist in this world as something more than property." Esmé's voice grew stronger. "What about you? What do you have left to lose?" Chaska considered the question. 3 years ago, he would have said he had nothing left. But sitting in this small house, watching Zia tend to her injured mother with the fierce devotion he remembered from his own childhood, he realized that wasn't entirely true. Pride, maybe. "The last piece of what I used to be. And is that worth fighting for?" Before he could answer, the sound of approaching horses reached them through the afternoon air. Chaska moved to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains. A dust cloud was rising in the distance, riders coming fast from the direction of town. "They're early," he said grimly. Zia pressed against the window beside him. "How many?" Chaska counted silently. "More than before. Maybe 20 men." Esmé struggled to sit up despite the pain. "You need to go. Get out while you can. They're not here for you. They are now." Chaska checked his rifle, an old Henry repeater that had served him through a dozen battles. "The moment I chose to help you, they became my enemy too. But you could still leave. Take Zia with you. Keep her safe." Chaska looked at the child, who was watching their conversation with the intensity of someone far older than her years. "Is that what you want, Zia, to run?" "No." Her voice was small but certain. "Mama says we don't run from bullies. We stand up to them. Even when they're bigger and stronger than we are? Especially then." Chaska felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years, something that might have been hope, or might have been the echo of the man he'd once been when his people looked to him for protection. "Then we make our stand here," he said simply. The riders were close enough now that individual horses could be distinguished. At their head rode a man Chaska didn't recognize, bigger than the others, sitting his horse with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through force. "That's Clayton Murdoch," Esmé said, having joined them at the window despite her injuries. "The man who wants my land." Chaska studied the approaching riders with a warrior's eye. They rode in a loose formation, confident and careless, men who expected no real resistance. Their horses were good, their weapons modern, but they moved like soldiers who'd never faced an enemy capable of fighting back. "They think this will be easy," he murmured. "Won't it be?" Esmé asked. Chaska's smile was sharp as a blade. "That depends on how much they know about Apache warfare." The riders were slowing now, spreading out to surround the house. Chaska counted 23 men, all armed, all looking eager for violence. The odds were impossible by any rational calculation. "In my medicine pouch," he told Zia, "there's a small leather bag with red markings. Bring it to me." Zia fetched the bag. which contained a mixture of clay and plant dyes that Apache warriors had used for generations before battle. Chaska dipped his fingers into the mixture and drew 2 lines across each cheek, war paint that hadn't marked his face in over a decade. "What does it mean?" Zia asked. "It means," Chaska said, picking up his war lance, "that today is a good day to remind the world that some people cannot be broken." The confrontation that followed would be talked about in Mercy Ridge for decades afterward, though the versions told in saloons bore little resemblance to what actually happened that afternoon. What the storytellers usually left out was the careful way Chaska positioned himself between the riders and the house, or how he planted his war lance in the hard ground like a battle standard, or the deadly calm in his voice when Clayton Murdoch finally rode close enough to speak. "You picked the wrong day to play Good Samaritan." "Apache!" Murdoch called out, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. Even the animals could sense the tension crackling in the air like heat lightning. "Every day is the right day to stand against injustice," Chaska replied. He stood perfectly still, his weathered hands resting on the shaft of his lance, looking for all the world like a man carved from the same red stone as the mountains behind him. "Injustice?" Murdoch's laugh was ugly. "The only injustice here is letting that woman squat on good grazing land when she's got no business being here in the first place. She has papers." "Legal claim. Papers don't mean much when you can't enforce them." Murdoch gestured to his men, who had spread out in a wide semicircle around the property. "I count 23 guns against your 1. Doesn't seem like good odds for an old man." Chaska's smile was thin as a knife blade. "I've faced worse odds with better men than these." The insult hit its mark. Several of Murdoch's riders shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward their weapons. But their leader held up a hand, stopping them. "You're that Apache chief, aren't you? The one who used to raid down from the mountains. Heard you were dead. Rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. Maybe so. But your time is over, old man. The Apache are finished in this territory. You belong on the reservation with the rest of your people." Chaska's eyes went cold. "My people are where they've always been, in the ground thanks to men like you. But I'm still here. Not for long." The standoff stretched like a held breath. From inside the house, Esmé watched through the window, her rifle ready despite her injuries. Zia crouched beside her, small hands gripping a knife Chaska had given her, not for fighting, but for cutting rope if she needed to escape. But it was Sheriff Tom Dalton's arrival that changed the dynamic. The lawman rode up slowly, his badge catching the afternoon sunlight, his face grim with the knowledge of what he was riding into. "Clayton," he said, dismounting with careful deliberation. "Didn't expect to see you out here with so many men. Just protecting my interests, Sheriff. This Apache is trespassing on private property." Dalton's eyes moved to Chaska, taking in the war paint, the lance, the absolute stillness that marked a dangerous man. "That your assessment of the situation, Chief?" "I am protecting a woman and child from men who would do them harm. In my culture, this is considered honorable." "In any culture," Dalton said quietly. Murdoch's face flushed red. "Whose side are you on here, Tom?" "The law's side." "Same as always." But Dalton's voice carried no conviction, and everyone present could hear it. "The law says that woman has to go. She's a danger to the community." "What law is that, Clayton?" "I've read the territorial statutes pretty thoroughly, and I don't recall anything about skin color voiding legal homestead claims." For the first time, Murdoch looked uncertain. He'd counted on the sheriff's tacit support, or at least his willingness to look the other way. Having Dalton actually invoke the law complicated things. "Sometimes a lawman has to see the bigger picture," Murdoch said carefully. "What's good for the community as a whole? And what's good for the community is driving out a woman who's never caused trouble for anyone. A woman who pays her taxes, trades fairly, and minds her own business. She doesn't belong here. According to who? You." The tension was building like steam in a kettle. Chaska could see it in the way the horses were starting to paw the ground, in how the riders were checking their weapons, in the set of Murdoch's shoulders as he realized this wasn't going to be as simple as he'd planned. "Sheriff," Murdoch said, his voice dropping to a dangerous level, I'd hate to think you were choosing the wrong side in this. It was a threat, barely veiled, and everyone knew it. In a town like Mercy Ridge, where Murdoch employed half the men and owned most of the businesses, crossing him could mean economic ruin or worse. Dalton was quiet for a long moment, and Chaska could see the war playing out behind his eyes, duty against survival, law against expedience. The man he'd wanted to be against the man circumstances had made him. "I'm choosing the law," Dalton said finally. "Same as I swore to do when I pinned on this badge." Murdoch's face went white with rage. "Then you're a bigger fool than I thought." From inside the house, a new sound emerged, the sharp crack of wood being broken. Someone had climbed through a back window and was ransacking the interior. Zia's cry of anger and fear carried clearly across the yard. "Get away from our things!" The distraction was all Murdoch's men needed. 3 of them spurred their horses toward the house, while the others closed in on Chaska and Dalton. But they'd underestimated both the Apache's reflexes and his knowledge of warfare. Chaska's lance left his hands like a thrown spear, taking one rider out of his saddle before he could draw his gun. In the same motion, the old warrior rolled toward the nearest piece of cover, a water trough that would stop rifle bullets, his own weapon coming up smooth and fast. The battle was brief, but vicious. Chaska fought like a man half his age, using every trick he'd learned in decades of warfare against overwhelming odds. He used the terrain, the angle of the sun, and the panic of horses unused to the smell of blood to turn 23 against 1 into a series of smaller fights he could win. When the shooting stopped, 5 of Murdoch's men were down, 3 more were wounded, and the rest were reconsidering their loyalty to a man who'd led them into a fight with a legend. But it was the sight of Zia standing in the doorway, holding her mother's rifle with hands that barely reached the trigger, that finally ended it. "The next one of you that moves toward my house gets shot," she announced in a voice that carried clearly across the sudden silence. Looking at this fierce child, her Apache protector bloodied but unbowed, and a sheriff who'd finally remembered what his badge meant. Clayton Murdoch realized that this particular piece of land was going to cost more than he was willing to pay. For now. "This isn't over," he told them as he gathered his remaining men. "No," Chaska agreed, retrieving his lance from the fallen rider. "It's not. But now you know what it will cost you." As the riders disappeared into the dust they'd raised, a burned cross could be seen in the distance, planted on the ridge overlooking Esmé's property, like a promise of future violence. The weeks that followed the confrontation brought an uneasy quiet to the homestead, the kind of stillness that comes before desert storms, when even the lizards disappear into their holes. Esmé's body healed slowly, her broken ribs knitting back together under Chaska's careful ministrations. But the emotional wounds ran deeper than anything visible to the eye. Chaska had moved his camp from the mountains to a spot near Esmé's well, close enough to respond to trouble, but far enough away to maintain some semblance of propriety. The arrangement suited none of them perfectly, but it was the compromise that circumstances demanded. In her medicine bag, Esmé kept a small pouch of seeds she'd saved from her first harvest, corn, beans and squash that had somehow managed to thrive in this harsh ground. The seeds represented more than next year's crop. They were her faith made tangible, proof that she believed in a future worth planting for. "You don't have to stay," she told Chaska one evening as they sat by his fire, watching Zia practice the Apache words he'd been teaching her. "You've done more than enough already." Chaska stirred the coals with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the star-filled sky. "Where would I go? Back to the mountains to wait for death? Forward to the reservation to wait for the same thing more slowly? You could go anywhere." "You're free." Freedom, he tested the word like it was unfamiliar. "I thought I was free when I left my people's fight behind, when I climbed into those mountains and turned my back on the world. But sitting up there alone, I wasn't free, I was just hiding," Esmé understood. She'd spent enough time running from one place to another, always looking over her shoulder, always ready to pack up and move on when the hostility became too much to bear. Freedom wasn't the absence of conflict. It was the right to stand and face it. The town blames you for what happened, she said. Maria told me people are saying you killed those men in cold blood. Only 2 died. The others were wounded. Chaska's voice held no emotion. But yes, I killed them. They came to hurt you and your daughter. In Apache law, that makes their deaths justified. What about white law? White law has never been interested in justice for my people. Why should I expect it to start now? They were interrupted by Zia's excited voice calling out in Spanish and Apache mixed together. She'd been practicing the words for different plants and animals, and her enthusiasm for learning made both adults smile despite their worries. She learns quickly, Chaska observed. Too quickly sometimes. She's growing up too fast. Children always grow up fast in hard times. My Ayana knew how to track game and start fires before she could properly walk. The world doesn't wait for us to be ready. Esmé watched her daughter, noting how the child moved with more confidence now, how she carried herself with the straight-backed pride that Chaska had been teaching her along with Apache words. It was good to see Zia strong, but it also meant accepting that innocence was one of the casualties of their situation. Sheriff Dalton had visited twice since the confrontation, ostensibly to check on their welfare, but really to gauge whether his decision to stand with them had been wise. The second visit, he'd brought news that wasn't entirely welcome. Clayton's been to the territorial capital, he'd told them, talking to people with more authority than me, calling in favors, making claims about Apache raids and public safety. What kind of claims? Esmé had asked. The kind that could bring federal troops if he pushes hard enough. The army doesn't much care about the particulars when they hear Apache and uprising in the same sentence. The threat of federal intervention hung over them like smoke from a distant fire, not immediately dangerous, but potentially devastating if the wind changed direction. Chaska had fought federal troops before and knew how that story usually ended, but there were other changes too. Subtle shifts that spoke of a different kind of battle being fought. Maria Santos had begun making more frequent trips to the homestead, bringing supplies and news from town. Other Mexican families who'd always kept their distance from both the Apache and the black woman, who dared to claim land, started nodding when they passed on the road instead of looking away. People are talking, Maria told them during one visit. Not all the talk is bad. Some folks are saying what Murdoch did was wrong, that no man should beat a woman for standing on her own land. And what are the others saying? Esmé asked, that you brought this trouble on yourself by not knowing your place. That harboring an Apache will bring down cavalry on all of us. Maria's weathered face was troubled. They're scared, Esmé. Scared people do dangerous things. The truth of that became evident when they found the dead coyote hanging from their fence post. Its throat cut and its body positioned as a clear message. Attached to its hind leg was a note written in an unsteady hand. This is what happens to animals that don't know where they belong. Chaska cut the coyote down and buried it with the same ceremony he would have used for any creature that had died unjustly. Zia watched the small ritual with eyes that had seen too much for someone her age. Why do they hate us so much? She asked. Fear, Chaska replied simply. Fear makes people cruel. Your mother threatens them because she proves that the world can be different than they want it to be. I threaten them because I remind them of what they took and how they took it. But we're not hurting anyone. No, but we're changing things just by existing. Some people would rather burn down the whole world than see it change. Despite the threats and the growing tension, something else was developing between Esmé and Chaska. A connection that went beyond shared danger and mutual respect. They found themselves talking long into the evenings, sharing stories from their very different pasts, discovering common ground in their experiences of loss and displacement. Chaska told her about his life before the wars, when the Apache moved freely through lands that had known their footsteps for countless generations. Esmé shared memories of small kindnesses from her years in bondage. Moments of human connection that had helped her maintain her sense of self even when the law said she was property. Do you ever think about what might have been? she asked one night as they watched Zia sleep peacefully in the house. Often, but thinking about what was, or what might have been, is a luxury for people with time to waste. We have today. We have tomorrow if we're lucky. That's enough to build on. Esmé nodded, her hand unconsciously moving to her seed pouch. Tomorrow was worth planning for, worth planting for, worth fighting for. And maybe, with enough tomorrows strung together, they could build something that resembled the peace they all craved. But peace, as they were about to learn, was not something that men like Clayton Murdoch were prepared to allow. The revelation came on a morning when the desert air still held the coolness of night, and the mountains stood outlined against a pale sky like sleeping giants. Zia had been exploring the area around Chaska's camp, her curiosity finally overcoming the warnings about disturbing his possessions. When she found the small leather portfolio hidden beneath his sleeping roll, the portfolio was old, the leather cracked and stained from years of handling, but the military documents inside were still clearly legible. At the top of the first page, in formal military script, were the words that would change everything. Certificate of Service, United States Army, Scout Division, Chaska, Apache Guide. Zia couldn't read all the words, but she could make out enough to understand that the documents were important. She brought them to her mother, her small face troubled by the weight of what she'd discovered. Esmé read the documents twice, then sat in stunned silence as their implications sank in. The man who'd risked his life to protect them, who'd become their guardian, and her growing affection, had once worked for the very army that had destroyed his own people. The dates showed he'd served as a scout from 1867 to 1869, years that coincided with some of the most brutal campaigns against Apache bands. When Chaska returned from checking the perimeter, he found them waiting by his fire, the documents spread between them like evidence at a trial. "You found them," he said simply, his voice carrying no surprise. "Were you ever going to tell us?" Esmé's voice was carefully controlled, but Chaska could hear the hurt beneath it. "I planned to. When the time seemed right." He settled across from them, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "But there never seemed to be a right time to explain how I helped hunt down my own people." Zia looked between the adults, sensing the tension, but not fully understanding its source. "What do the papers mean?" Chaska's eyes closed briefly. When he opened them, they held a pain so deep it seemed to have its own weight. "They mean that I was a traitor to my people, child. They mean that I guided cavalry soldiers to Apache camps, that I helped them track warriors and families trying to escape to Mexico. Why?" The question came from Esmé, soft but relentless. "Because I believed." Chaska's voice broke, and he had to start again. "Because I believed that if I helped them, if I showed them that some Apache could be trusted, they would treat the rest of my people fairly. I thought I could save lives by ending the war quickly." The faded photograph that had triggered the discovery showed Chaska in army uniform, standing beside a cavalry officer. He looked younger, his face unmarked by the lines of grief that now carved deep channels from his eyes to his jaw. But even in the old image, there was something haunted in his expression. "I was young and foolish," he continued. "I believed in honor, in the possibility that enemies could become friends if they just understood each other. The army officers told me I was helping to bring peace, that my knowledge could prevent unnecessary bloodshed, and did it." Esmé's question held no judgment, only a need to understand. For a while, I told myself it did. I guided them to camps that were already empty, gave them information that was mostly useless. I thought I was playing both sides, protecting my people while satisfying the army's need for an Apache guide. Chaska stood and walked to the edge of his camp, looking out at the vast expanse of desert that had once known the free passage of his people. But intelligence has a way of accumulating. Small pieces of information that seemed harmless alone became devastating when put together. Routes I showed them, water sources I identified, seasonal patterns I explained. It all became part of a larger strategy to corner and defeat Apache resistance. The weight of his confession settled over them like dust. Zia, still not fully comprehending, but understanding that something important was happening. moved closer to her mother. "The winter campaign of 1869, Chaska said, his voice barely above a whisper. "General Crook used information I'd provided to locate 3 separate bands that had taken refuge in the Dragoon Mountains. My information helped them plan an attack that left 47 people dead, including 12 children. Esmé felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Your own people, distant cousins of my wife, children who'd played with my daughter. Warriors I'd grown up alongside." Chaska turned back to face them, and the pain in his eyes was almost unbearable to witness. "When word reached our band about what had happened, about how the cavalry had known exactly where to find them, suspicion fell on me immediately. They blamed you. They were right to blame me. I had betrayed them, even if that hadn't been my intention. My wife's family demanded that I be exiled from the band. My own warriors turned their backs on me. Even my wife," his voice caught, "even my wife couldn't look at me the same way." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of old grief and present complications. Finally, Zia spoke up with the directness that only children possess. "But you're helping us now. That's different, isn't it?" Chaska's smile was painful to see. "Is it? How do you trust a man who's betrayed his own people? How do you know I won't betray you too when it becomes convenient?" It was Esmé who answered, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "Because betrayal requires someone to betray. You don't have any people left to sell us out to." The brutal honesty of her words hit Chaska like a physical blow. She was right. He was a man without a tribe, without a people, without any loyalty, except what he chose to give. In some ways, that made him more trustworthy, not less. "The army discharged me after the winter campaign," he continued. "Too many complaints from other Apache scouts, too much suspicion about my divided loyalties. I spent the next 10 years trying to find a place for myself, too Apache for white society, too tainted by collaboration for my own people." "Is that why you went to the mountains?" "To hide? To die, more accurately. I thought if I removed myself from the world entirely, maybe the guilt would follow me into whatever comes after." Esmé studied his face, seeing in it the man who'd risked everything to help them, who'd stood against overwhelming odds because a child had asked him to. "But you didn't die?" "No, I just waited for death, while living like a ghost until Zia found you, until Zia found me." He agreed. The child in question had been listening to this exchange with the intense concentration she brought to important lessons. Now she looked up at Chaska with eyes that held no condemnation, only curiosity. "Are you sorry you helped the army?" "Every day of my life." "And are you sorry you helped us?" "No, never." "Then you're not the same person you were before." "People can change, can't they?" From the mouths of babes, Esmé thought. Her daughter had cut straight to the heart of the matter with the simplicity that adults often lost in their complications. "Yes," Chaska said, kneeling down to Zia's level. "People can change. But change doesn't erase what came before." "Maybe not," Esmé said quietly. "But it can determine what comes after." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders, not the thunderous charge of Murdoch's men, but the steady pace of people with official business. Sheriff Dalton rode up with 2 other men, their expressions grim with purpose. "Chaska," Dalton called out, "I need you to come with me. There are federal marshals in town asking questions about an Apache war chief who's been terrorizing settlers. Someone's been telling stories about raids and massacres that sound suspiciously like your recent activities." Chaska understood immediately. Murdoch had found a new weapon, one that struck at the very foundation of his past mistakes. "Let me guess. Anonymous reports about an Apache scout turned renegade." "Something like that." "They've got warrants, Chaska." "For questioning at first, but we both know how these things tend to go." Esmé felt her world shifting beneath her feet. Just when she'd begun to imagine a future that included the possibility of happiness, the past was reaching out to reclaim its due. "You don't have to go," she said, though they both knew it wasn't true. "Yes, I do. Running would only confirm their suspicions and bring more trouble down on you." Chaska gathered his few possessions, including the damning portfolio. "But this doesn't change anything between us." "If you'll have me back." Esmé looked at this man, who'd revealed himself to be far more complicated than she'd imagined. Neither pure hero nor simple villain, but something harder to categorize and easier to understand. A person trying to live with the consequences of choices made in impossible circumstances. "We'll be here," she said simply. As the riders disappeared toward town, the burned cross on the ridge seemed to mock their hopes with its promise of more conflict to come. The federal marshals kept Chaska for 3 days, 3 nights that felt like 3 months to Esmé and Zia as they waited for word of his fate. During those long hours, Esmé found herself staring at her land deed, the legal document that proved her ownership but felt increasingly fragile in her hands. Like paper that might crumble at the first strong wind, the deed represented everything she'd fought for. But it was also becoming clear that legal documents meant little when men like Clayton Murdoch decided they wanted what you had. Still, she folded it carefully each night and tucked it into her blouse, close to her heart, as if proximity to her body could give it the strength to withstand whatever was coming. On the second day, Maria Santos brought news from town that made Esmé's blood run cold. "They're organizing," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper as she glanced nervously toward the road. "Murdoch is calling it a citizens' committee for public safety, but everyone knows what it really is. They're planning to come for you tonight, tomorrow, soon." "How many?" "Most of the men in town, maybe 40, 50 people. They're saying you harbored a dangerous renegade, that you're a threat to every family in the territory." Esmé looked out at her small garden, her chickens pecking in the yard, the well that had taken her 2 months to dig properly. Everything she'd built with her own hands, everything that represented her claim to dignity and freedom, was about to be swept away by men who couldn't stand the idea of a black woman owning something they wanted. "What about Sheriff Dalton?" Maria's expression grew troubled. "He's trying to do the right thing, but his hands are tied. The federal marshals outrank him, and they're asking a lot of questions about why he didn't arrest Chaska immediately after the fighting. Some people are saying he's not fit to be sheriff anymore." That evening, as Zia helped her mother prepare a simple supper, the child asked the question that had been weighing on both their minds. "Are we going to run away?" Esmé paused in her stirring of the beans, considering her words carefully. "Would you want to run away?" "No, but I don't want them to hurt you again either. Sometimes, baby girl, standing up for what's right means accepting that you might get hurt. The question is whether the thing you're standing up for is worth the risk." Zia nodded solemnly. "Like when Chaska stood up for us even though it was dangerous?" "Exactly like that." On the 3rd morning, Sheriff Dalton rode out alone, his face grim with news that confirmed their worst fears. Behind him, a dust cloud on the horizon spoke of many riders following at a distance. "They released him," Dalton said without preamble as he dismounted. "The federal marshals found no evidence of recent raids or violence against civilians. Someone's been telling tall tales about Apache uprisings. That's good news, isn't it?" Esmé asked, though something in Dalton's expression suggested otherwise. "It would be, except Murdoch's convinced half the territory that legal technicalities don't matter when it comes to public safety. He's got people believing that Chaska will start raiding again the moment the federals leave. And when do they leave?" "This afternoon. They're heading back to Tucson with their report." Dalton's voice was heavy with implication. "Once they're gone, territorial law takes over." "My law, such as it is," Esmé understood. "Without federal oversight. The situation would revert to the brutal mathematics of frontier justice. Whoever had the most guns and the least conscience would determine what happened next. Where's Chaska now?" "Riding hard for the mountains, I'd guess." The marshals released him at dawn, and he headed out immediately. Smart man knows when to cut his losses and run. But even as Dalton spoke the words, they all knew he was wrong. Chaska was many things: a warrior, a survivor, a man carrying heavy burdens from his past, but he wasn't. Someone who abandoned people who'd trusted him. The proof came too. Hours later, when Zia spotted a familiar figure moving among the rocks above their homestead. Chaska had returned, but not to the exposed position of his old camp. Instead, he'd taken up a defensive position in the hills that commanded a clear view of all approaches to Esmé's property. When they climbed up to find him, they discovered that he'd spent his 3 days of captivity planning for exactly this scenario. His new position was carefully chosen, protected by natural stone walls with clear fields of fire and multiple escape routes if retreat became necessary. "You came back," Esmé said. "Though it wasn't really a question. Did you think I wouldn't?" "I thought you might be smart enough to save yourself while you could." Chaska's smile was grim. "I tried being smart once. It didn't work out well for anyone involved." He'd brought more than just tactical knowledge to this final confrontation. Somehow, during his brief time in custody, he'd managed to send word to people who owed him debts from the old days. As the afternoon wore on, 3 other Apache appeared among the rocks, older men who'd fought beside him in the territorial wars. Veterans who'd been living quietly on the edges of white settlements, but who remembered what they owed their former war leader. "This is Nalnish," Chaska said, introducing a scarred man who moved with the fluid grace of a born warrior. "And Goyakla and Taza, they've come to help settle an old debt." "What debt?" Esmé asked. It was Nalnish who answered, his English careful but clear. "Many years ago, Chaska saved our families when the cavalry came. We escaped to Mexico because he delayed the soldiers long enough for us to get away. Now we return the favor." Esmé felt tears sting her eyes. These men had risked everything to come here, had traveled across dangerous territory and put themselves in harm's way for people they barely knew, all because of loyalty to a man who'd once protected their children. "You don't have to do this," she told them. "This isn't your fight." Goyakla, the youngest of the 3, spoke up with a fierce pride that reminded her of Chaska. "Any fight against those who would drive good people from their homes is our fight. We have seen too many forced migrations, too many families scattered to the winds." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Sheriff Dalton made one last visit. This time, he came not as a lawman, but as a man wrestling with his conscience. "I can't stop what's coming," he told them bluntly. "Murdoch's got too many people stirred up, and they're convinced that order can only be restored by making an example of you." "What kind of example?" Esmé asked. "The permanent kind." Dalton's voice was heavy with implications he couldn't bring himself to speak directly. "But I want you to know, when this is over, whatever happens, I'll see that the truth gets told. Your land rights will be protected legally, even if I can't protect them physically tonight." "Tonight?" "They're gathering at sundown. We'll be here by full dark, I'd guess. Maybe 30, 40 men, all armed and convinced they're doing righteous work." Chaska had been listening from the rocks above, and now he called down to them. "Sheriff, you should leave now. What happens next isn't something a lawman should witness." Dalton looked up at the Apache warriors positioned among the stones, then at Esmé, standing beside her small house with her rifle in her hands and her daughter close beside her. He was seeing the moment when law failed and something more primitive took its place, the ancient mathematics of those who would defend their homes against those who would take them. "For what it's worth," he said as he remounted his horse, "I think you people are on the right side of this." As darkness began to settle over the desert, Esmé gathered her most precious possessions, her freedom papers, the deed to her land, a small daguerreotype of James, and her pouch of seeds for next year's planting. If they survived the night, she would rebuild. If they didn't, she wanted these pieces of her life to survive as testimony to what she'd tried to accomplish. Chaska climbed down from his position to help with the final preparations. Working together, they checked weapons, positioned supplies, and made sure Zia knew exactly where to go if shooting started. "Are you afraid?" he asked Esmé as they worked. "Terrified," she admitted, "but also angry and determined. They can kill me, but they can't make me ashamed of what I've built here." "Good. Fear keeps you alive. Anger gives you strength. And determination." He paused, looking out at the approaching darkness where torches were beginning to flicker like malevolent stars. "Determination might just be enough to see us through to morning." In the distance, the sound of many horses reached them on the night wind. The reckoning that had been building since the day Esmé first claimed her land was finally at hand. They came like a plague of locusts across the desert floor, their torches turning the night into a hellscape of dancing shadows and malevolent light. 43 men rode toward Esmé's homestead, their faces masks of righteous fury and barely contained violence. At their head rode Clayton Murdoch, his massive frame silhouetted against the flame-lit darkness like some demon from a fever. Dream, the burning torch in Murdoch's hand, represented more than illumination. It was a symbol of the mob's destructive intent, the light that revealed true character in the darkest moments of human nature. Some of the men riding behind him carried ropes. Others bore crude weapons fashioned from farm tools. All of them believed they were doing God's work by driving out the woman who dared to claim equality in their corner of hell. From her position in the adobe house, Esmé watched their approach through a gap in the shutters. Her rifle was loaded and ready, her hands steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Beside her, Zia crouched with the knife Chaska had given her, not for fighting, but for cutting through rope or boards if escape became necessary. "Remember what we practiced," Esmé whispered to her daughter. "If anything happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you," Zia interrupted with fierce determination. "We're going to fight them off and still be here when the sun comes up." Esmé smiled, despite the circumstances. Her daughter's faith was absolute, untainted by the adult understanding of how badly outnumbered they were, how slim their chances of surviving the next few hours actually looked. In the rocks above the house, Chaska and his 3 Apache companions waited with the patience of predators. They'd positioned themselves to create overlapping fields of fire, turning the natural terrain into a fortress that would force the attackers to fight on Apache terms rather than their own. The mob stopped just outside rifle range, their horses pawing nervously at ground that seemed to hold the promise of violence. Murdoch dismounted and stepped forward, his torch held high like a battle standard. "Esmé Delphine," he called out, his voice echoing off the surrounding rocks. "Come out and face what you've brought on yourself." Esmé stepped onto her porch, her rifle cradled in her arms, but not yet pointed at anyone specific. In the torchlight, she looked like a figure from legend, a woman who'd chosen to stand against impossible odds, rather than bend her knee to injustice. "This is my land," she called back, her voice carrying clearly across the space between them. "I have legal papers proving my ownership. You have no right to be here." Murdoch's laugh was ugly in the desert air. "Legal papers? You think papers matter when decent people are threatened by savages and their sympathizers? The only savages I see are the ones carrying torches to a woman's home in the middle of the night." The insult hit its mark. Several of the riders shifted angrily in their saddles, hands moving toward weapons. But Murdoch held up a restraining hand. He wanted to maintain the fiction that this was justice rather than mob violence. "You harbored a known Apache renegade. You refused to cooperate with federal authorities. You've made yourself an enemy of law-abiding citizens. I helped a man who protected me and my daughter from cowards who beat women in broad daylight. If that makes me an enemy of law-abiding citizens, then your law is corrupt." "Our law," Murdoch said, his patience finally running thin, "says that people like you don't get to own land that rightfully belongs to Americans. I am an American, your property that got ideas." Above its station, the words hung in the air like a physical blow. Around Murdoch, some of his followers shifted uncomfortably. They'd come here to drive out a dangerous element, not to relitigate the recently concluded war over slavery. But others nodded approval, their faces hard with the conviction that some people were simply born to serve rather than own. "Last chance," Murdoch continued. "Pack up your belongings and leave. We'll give you until sunrise to get off this land, and if I refuse..." Murdoch's smile was terrible in the torchlight. "Then we'll remove you ourselves. And that Apache lover you've been harboring will make sure he doesn't threaten any more decent families." That was when Chaska's voice rang out from the darkness above, calm and deadly as winter wind. "I'm right here, Murdoch. No need to hunt for me. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Horses shied and reared as their riders tried to locate the source of the voice. Several men drew weapons, their heads turning frantically as they searched the rocks and shadows. "Show yourself, Apache." "I'm already showing myself. You just lack the eyes to see." A rifle shot cracked from the rocks, and the torch in Murdoch's hand exploded in a shower of sparks. In the sudden darkness that followed, chaos erupted as men fought to control spooked horses while trying to determine where the attack was coming from. "Light the torches," Murdoch roared. "All of them. I want this place bright as day." More torches flared to life, but they only served to make better targets. From multiple positions in the rocks, muzzle flashes began to bloom like deadly flowers, each one accompanied by the sharp crack of precision shooting. This wasn't the wild spray of desperate defenders. This was the calculated marksmanship of warriors who'd spent decades perfecting their craft. Men fell from their saddles, some wounded, others playing dead, all of them realizing that they'd walked into something far more dangerous than they'd bargained for. "Fall back," someone shouted. "They're in the rocks. We can't see them." But Murdoch wasn't ready to retreat, not yet. He'd brought 43 men to deal with one woman and an old Apache. He wasn't going home empty-handed. The battle reached its crescendo when Murdoch, driven by rage and humiliation, spurred his horse directly toward Esmé's house, firing wildly with his pistol. Behind him, a dozen of his most loyal followers charged in a desperate assault that shattered the careful tactical balance of the fight. Chaska's war lance, the weapon that had served him through countless battles, splintered against a boulder. As he used it to deflect a rifle shot aimed at Zia, the broken shaft fell to the rocks below, its carved symbols of victory and defeat lost in the darkness. But the destruction of his lance marked something more significant than the loss of a weapon. It represented the end of his warrior past and the beginning of a new kind of strength found in protection rather than conquest. From the house, Esmé's rifle spoke with deadly accuracy, dropping 2 riders before they could reach her porch. But more kept coming, their numbers overwhelming the defensive positions. She heard Zia cry out behind her and turned to see Pike, Murdoch's scarecrow lieutenant, climbing through a back window with a knife in his teeth and murder in his eyes. "Get away from her!" Esmé swung her rifle like a club, catching Pike across the temple and sending him crashing back through the window he'd just climbed through. But the distraction cost her. Murdoch's massive form filled her doorway, his face a mask of blood and fury. His own rifle had been lost in the charge, but his hands were weapons enough, hands that could crush a man's windpipe or break a child's neck. "Time to teach you your place," he snarled. Reaching for her, that was when Zia proved that courage had nothing to do with size or age. The 6-year-old girl launched herself at Murdoch's legs, her small knife flashing as she struck at the giant man's knees and shins. Her attack wouldn't have stopped him, but it distracted him long enough for Esmé to bring her rifle's buttstock up in a crushing blow to his jaw. Murdoch staggered, but didn't fall. Blood streamed from his mouth as he grabbed for Esmé's throat with hands like iron clamps. For a moment, it seemed the fight would end with her death, this woman who'd claimed the right to dignity, crushed by a man who believed might made right. But salvation came from an unexpected source. Sheriff Tom Dalton appeared in the doorway behind Murdoch, his own gun drawn and pointed at the rancher's skull. "That's enough, Clayton." "Tom!" Murdoch's voice was thick with blood and disbelief. "What the hell are you doing here?" "My job, finally." Dalton's voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly as he kept his weapon trained on the larger man. "Step away from Mrs. Delphine. You're choosing the wrong side, Sheriff." "No, I'm choosing the law. The real law, not the version you've been peddling." Around them, the sounds of battle were diminishing as Murdoch's followers realized their leader was captured and their tactical situation hopeless. The Apache warriors had used the terrain masterfully, turning what should have been an overwhelming assault into a series of individual defeats. But it was what happened next that truly ended the fight. From the rocks above, a voice called out in Apache. It was Nalnish, speaking to his companions in their own language. One by one, the three warriors who'd come to help Chaska began to withdraw, melting back into the darkness from which they'd come. "Why are they leaving?" Zia asked, pressing close to her mother. Chaska emerged from the rocks, moving slowly and deliberately so no one would mistake his intentions. His face was painted with blood, some his own, some from the men he'd fought, but his eyes were calm, because the real battle was never about defeating these men, he said simply. It was about proving they could be defeated, about showing that some people won't be broken, no matter how much force is used against them. Murdoch looked around at his scattered followers, some wounded, others demoralized, all of them realizing that their righteous cause had turned into something ugly and shameful. The torches that had seemed so symbolic of their purpose now illuminated a scene of chaos and failure. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Esmé replied. She stood in her doorway, her daughter beside her, her rifle in her hands, looking every inch the woman who belonged exactly where she was. "This is my land, my home, my family, and no amount of violence is going to change that." Sheriff Dalton holstered his weapon and began the process of restoring order. Several of Murdoch's men would need medical attention, and there would be questions to answer about who started what and why. But the fundamental issue had been decided not by law or politics, but by the simple fact that some people would fight to the death for the right to exist with dignity. As the defeated mob began its retreat toward town, Chaska knelt beside the broken pieces of his war lance. The weapon that had carried him through so many battles was destroyed, but something more important had taken its place, the knowledge that he'd found a new kind of warrior's path, one that led not to conquest, but to protection. "Will they come back?" Zia asked. Chaska looked at the retreating torches, then at the house where Esmé stood victorious in her own doorway. "Not like this. Not ever again like this." 3 months after the night that would forever change Mercy Ridge, Esmé stood in her garden, watching new plants push their way up through soil that had been watered with blood and tears. The green shoots represented more than a successful harvest. They were proof that life could take root and flourish, even in the harshest ground. That hope was more stubborn than hate. The legal proceedings that followed the confrontation had been swift and decisive. Sheriff Dalton's testimony, corroborated by 3 wounded members of Murdoch's mob who'd grown tired of carrying lies, established the truth of what had happened that night. Clayton Murdoch was convicted of assault and inciting a riot, sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison. Several of his followers faced lesser charges, while others simply left the territory, rather than face the shame of what they'd participated in. But the real changes in Mercy Ridge went deeper than any court judgment. Esmé's successful defense of her homestead had become something larger than one woman's fight for her land. Word spread throughout the territory of the black woman who'd stood against a mob and won, of the Apache warriors who'd chosen to protect rather than raid, of the sheriff who'd finally remembered what his badge meant. The story took on a life of its own, growing with each telling, becoming a symbol of possibility in a harsh country that usually offered only harsh choices. Maria Santos visited regularly now, no longer keeping her friendship hidden from those who might disapprove. The Mexican families began stopping by during their travels, trading goods and sharing news. Even some of the white homesteaders who'd previously avoided Esmé started, acknowledging her with respectful nods when their paths crossed in town. Change was gradual but unmistakable. Mercy Ridge was becoming a place where people could coexist without pretending that differences didn't exist. They still disagreed, still sometimes distrusted each other, but the violent certainty that had driven the mob was harder to maintain after seeing where it led. Chaska had built a new home on a corner of Esmé's property, close enough to provide protection but far enough away to maintain propriety. The structure was a blend of Apache and Mexican building techniques, using adobe bricks and traditional wooden framework to create something that belonged fully to neither culture but felt comfortable to both. He'd also taken on the role of unofficial teacher for the local children, sharing knowledge of desert survival, plant identification, and traditional hunting techniques. The lessons were practical, rather than cultural. No one was trying to turn white children into Apache warriors, but they served to break down some of the fear and misunderstanding that had fed the violence. "Why do you do it?" Esmé asked him one evening as they watched Zia practice tracking skills with two Mexican children whose parents had finally felt safe enough to bring them around. "Do what?" "Teach them, help them. After everything that's happened, why do you still have faith in people?" Chaska considered the question as he watched the children work together, their laughter echoing across the desert. "Because children learn what we teach them. If we teach them to hate, they become people like Murdoch's followers. If we teach them to see each other as human beings, maybe they become something better." Esmé nodded, understanding. She'd been teaching Zia to read from books that included stories about different kinds of people, different ways of living, different possibilities for what the world could become. Education, she'd learned, was another form of planting seeds. Sheriff Dalton had proven himself a changed man in the months following the confrontation. He'd established new policies for handling disputes between different ethnic groups, insisting on evidence rather than assumptions, requiring actual crimes rather than convenient prejudices. His badge carried more weight now, backed by the respect he'd earned during the crisis. "People are saying you might run for territorial representative," Esmé told him during one of his visits. Dalton smiled ruefully. "People say a lot of things, but I think I'll stick to being sheriff for now. Still plenty of work to do here before I start thinking about bigger stages." The work was indeed ongoing. Not everyone in Mercy Ridge had embraced the changes. Some families had moved away, rather than live in a community where a black woman could own land and Apache could walk freely. Others stayed but nursed their resentments quietly, waiting for circumstances to shift back in their favor. But momentum, Esmé had learned, was a powerful force. Each day that passed without violence, each interaction that ended in trade rather than conflict, each child who grew up seeing cooperation as normal instead of exceptional, all of it built towards something that would be harder and harder to tear down. On a warm evening in late spring, as Zia helped Chaska tend a small fire outside his house, Esmé found herself thinking about James and the dreams they'd shared of building something lasting. She still wore his ring on the chain around her neck, still felt the ache of his absence. But she'd also discovered that love could take new forms without betraying old ones. "Mama!" Zia called out. "Chaska says he wants to ask you something important." Esmé looked up to find the Apache warrior approaching with unusual nervousness, his weathered hands fidgeting with something small and wrapped in leather. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about what it means to build a life with someone, about what it means to choose family." He unwrapped the leather to reveal a bracelet made from silver and turquoise, crafted in traditional Apache style but incorporating elements that spoke to Esmé's own heritage. Small, wooden beads carved with symbols that represented both strength and nurturing. "This isn't a proposal," he said quickly. "Not in the white sense or the Apache sense. But it's a promise. To stand with you, to help you protect what you've built, to be part of whatever future you're planting here." Esmé took the bracelet, feeling its weight in her hands. It was beautiful, but more than that, it was honest. A symbol of partnership rather than possession, of choice rather than obligation. "And what about Zia?" she asked. "She'd be part of this too." Chaska knelt down to the child's level. "Zia, would you accept an old Apache warrior as part of your family? Only if you promise to keep teaching me how to track animals and find water in the desert," she replied solemnly. "I promise." Esmé fastened the bracelet around her wrist, feeling its significance settle into her bones like planted seeds taking root. This was how change really happened, not through grand gestures or dramatic pronouncements, but through small choices made by ordinary people who decided that tomorrow could be different from yesterday. As the stars emerged overhead, painting the desert sky with ancient light, three very different people sat together by their fire. planning a garden for next year's planting.